Chapter 6 Maylee Makes a Wish. When they got home, it was lunchtime, and the children joined their respective families. After lunch, Peter and Maylee discovered to their huge dismay that their mother had taken the afternoon off from her work and was planning to take them to see their cousins. They always loved visiting them, but this obviously palled in comparison to going on a time travel adventure to Egypt, to the time when King Timenhut ruled. "I'm sorry," Peter said to Sam and Jane, adding, "It's a total pain." "Never mind," Sam said. "We can go when you come back. You're not going to be more than 3.5 hours or so, surely." "No, well, I jolly well hope not," Peter said. "Then let's meet at the pond at 4:30 and get the stone, okay?" "Maybe in the meantime we can research on Horus and Timenhut and find out what to wear," Jane suggested. She loved the dressing up part of time travel. One did not want to stick out like a sore thumb when one arrived, after all. Sam and Jane went to the farm computer and Googled Ancient Egypt and King Timenhut. They found lots and lots of information on ancient Egypt, but absolutely nothing on an Egyptian king called Timenhut. "It's weird," Jane said. "Professor Camel thingy." "Gamal," Sam interjected. "Professor Gamal. He said Timenhut was so famous, but there's nothing on the internet about him at all." Sam looked thoughtful and was silent a moment. Then he said, "I wonder why Professor Gamal was so interested in our mention of a magic stone. Grown-ups don't believe in magic." "Yes," Jane said, "that was odd. He was quite fierce about it." "Well, it makes me think that that was a carving of our stone that we saw in Horus's hands and in the hieroglyphics. And, Sam stuttered as he put two and two together. "He was reading a book called Amulets of Egypt." "Amulets?" Jane looked confused. "You think our stone is an amulet, an Egyptian amulet?" "Yes, exactly. It would explain so much. Quick, Google Egyptian amulet." Google immediately came up with lots of pages about Egyptian amulets. It seemed that there were many different sorts and that they were used to protect people from evil, to help them into the afterlife, and so on. They were used by young and old, rich and poor, Sam read, to invoke the powers of gods and other magical forces. Spells were spoken over amulets to activate their magic powers, and they were used in religious ceremonies, that's funeral, rites, and in day-to-day living. "So, we have a magical amulet, maybe from Timenhut's time?" Jane said wonderingly. "Maybe," Sam said, his eyes shining. "Well, we can go back in time and see," Jane said. Gamal would be so jealous." Sam laughed. "Well, yes, but I'm glad he isn't, or it would mean he knew all about our stone. Let's do some research and decide what we're going to wear before the others come back." This proved tricky, as the main dress code seemed to be a loincloth and a bare chest in the case of men, or cunningly draped white dresses and skirts in the case of women. "It says here that children didn't wear clothes until they were 6, Jane said, and she and Sam looked at each other and giggled at the thought of what 5-year-old Maylee, who was very fussy about her clothes, would say to that. "Just dress her in one of your T-shirts, so it's like a baggy dress," Sam instructed. In the end, he picked out plain white T-shirts for himself and Peter, only they were more of a grey and white, being old, and sneaked 2 hand towels out of the laundry cupboard to make skirt-like loincloths, like those shown in Egyptian artworks. He took 4 other towels too, suggesting that they could be used as cloaks or shawls or skirts to cover up their clothes if they turned out to be very inappropriate. This all took some time, and it was a while before they found themselves sitting on the porch, drinking tea and dunking Mrs. Nell's delicious homemade buttermilk rusks. After the 3rd rusk, they saw Peter and Maylee running across the field. "We're ready to go," Peter gasped breathlessly as he came up. The slowly passing hours of the afternoon had been torture for him. Jane laughed. "Go and catch your breath and put on your loincloth." Once they were ready, they sneaked out the house by climbing out of Sam's window, not wanting to be seen and questioned about the towels or strange clothing. They headed down to the pond, which was fortunately far from the house, and screened from view by a number of trees. Sam waded in and fished around. He found the stone quickly, feeling as always a surge of relief. As he lifted it up from its muddy hidey hole, he noticed some strange tadpoles. They weren't hiding on the sides or bottom of the pond, as tadpoles usually did, but floated in the water. They had long, catfish-like feelers hanging from each side of their mouths and were fascinatingly transparent, like glass. Their insides could be seen through their clear skins. "Hey, check these out," Sam said to Peter. When they were younger, they'd been obsessed with tadpoles and frogs, and the old fascination still lurked. "Look, they're like glass tadpoles." As he spoke, he handed the stone to Peter so that he could reach into the pond and try and catch one. "Let me see," Peter said eagerly, and held the stone out behind him, meaning Jane to take it. But Maylee, who'd never yet been allowed to touch it, reached up and snatched it. She and Jane stood and watched while Peter and Sam peered into the murky water, waiting for the mud to settle so that Sam could make another attempt to catch a taddy. Jane sighed and shuffled her feet impatiently. Honestly, how like the boys to get distracted by tadpoles when they could be in ancient Egypt. Bored, Maylee's mind turned to her library book about Dan the camel. "I wish we could go to the Sahara desert and find Dan," Maylee said to her, and Jane was just about to reply that the Sahara desert was probably not a very nice place to go when she felt a familiar falling feeling. The girls landed with a thump on soft, hot sand. "Maylee!" Jane screamed. A squeaky sound next to her confirmed that Maylee was there too, but as they sat up, looking around, horribly disorientated, it became clear that the boys were not. "Maylee, what did you do?" Jane said aghast. "I'm sorry," Maylee said, bursting into tears. Jane was short on tact but soft-hearted, and she immediately hugged her. "It's okay. I guess we can go home when... You have the stone, right?" "Yes," Maylee said meekly, holding out her hand. In it lay the stone. Jane snatched it up and put it in the pocket of her shorts, which she was wearing under her rather strange mock Egyptian dress. The girls stood up and looked around them. They were in a thick grove of palm trees. Through the trunks they could see something glistening and blue. "That's weird," Jane said. "Water in the Sahara desert? Maybe the stone has kindly put us down by an oasis. I wonder where we are." "Let's look around," Maylee said. "The boys are going to be cross with us for not taking them," she added. "Well, the way the magic works, we'll be back with them in a minute, even if we stay a while here, so they won't be cross for long." At that very moment, the girls heard a strange, distant sound. "What is that?" Maylee asked. "Not sure." The girls listened carefully. "That's seriously weird. It sounds like singing," Jane said, and after another couple of minutes, it became clear that that was indeed what it was. At Jane's instruction, the girls hid behind the trunk of a large palm and peered in the direction of the sounds. They could hear the singers coming closer. Rich male voices were singing a lovely rhythmic chanting kind of song. After a while, the singers appeared abruptly through a clump of palm trees. They were two men, each of whom was sitting on the back of a heavily laden camel. "Camels!" screeched Maylee, and as one, the heads of the men swiveled towards the girls. The men looked astounded and stood still for a good couple of minutes, staring across at the girls and talking together. They looked mysterious and a bit frightening, as their heads and faces were covered in folds of turbans made from faded blue cloth. Only their eyes were visible. They wore long tunic-like shirts which hung to their calves, loose pants, and from their broad belts hung long scabbards from which protruded curved sword hilts. "Maylee!" Jane hissed, and, dragging Maylee, took a few steps backwards. She was wondering if she should wish them home immediately, but she was avid for adventure and persuaded herself that the stone wanted her and Maylee there in that strange palm tree place. The foremost man seemed to realize they were scared and smiled and waved, saying something in a strange language, removing the cloth from his face. It was brown and incredibly wrinkled, but despite the wrinkles, he didn't look old. Rather, he looked strong and healthy and rather wild. He seemed to be the leader and walked slowly and carefully towards them, like they were young animals he didn't want to spook. He spoke and smiled in a friendly manner as he came towards them, trying hard to communicate, but it was useless. Jane, who fancied herself as a natural at languages, said, "No comprendo," and shrugged with her hands held up to show she didn't understand. The man then beckoned to the girls to follow him, and, keeping a cautious distance behind, they did so. He gestured politely to them to sit down and said something to the other man, who started to untie various straps and take things off the camels. The girls noticed that most of the baggage was resting on what looked like a kind of luggage rack, which had 4 carved bits of wood on each corner. Once the luggage was taken off, these were turned over so that they stood on 4 legs and served as a table. "Eat?" Jane said to Maylee, but Maylee wasn't looking. She was busy watching the leader kneeling over a little pile of leaves and grass and hitting 2 rocks against each other, a bit like striking a match. He must have made a spark because he leant over the little pile and blew, and a wisp of smoke drifted up. As he added larger and larger bits of twig and plant, the flames grew into a full-blown fire. Next, he brought out a battered tin, went and collected water from the river, and put it to boil. The older man beckoned for them to come and sit by the fire, and cautiously, because it seemed rude to refuse, the girls did so. He took out a wooden box and threw some small green pellets into the water. The girls sat in silence, feeling awkward. After a few minutes, one of the men brought out 4 small metal cups and poured out the brew. He handed one to Maylee and Jane, then offered them each a hard, dry piece of flatbread. Feeling it was the polite thing to do, the 2 girls reluctantly accepted a piece. "In this culture, it's extremely rude to refuse to eat and drink when you offered," Jane told Maylee bossily, as she sipped her drink and pulled her face. It was unpleasantly bitter. "What culture is it?" Maylee asked. Not quite sure yet. Some kind of desert, nomad, camel culture," Jane said. "What's a nomad?" "Nomads are people who travel around, often with flocks of animals, and they don't stay in any place for long." Jane was getting a bit bored and was wondering how to shake off their new acquaintances politely so they could go and do some exploring. One of the men adjusted his loose-hanging tunic sleeve as he bent to put more sticks on the fire, and Jane noticed with alarm that he had a short dagger strapped to his arm. What kind of nomad went around with swords on his belt and knives on his arm? As they struggled to eat the hard bread and drink their tea, one of the men took the camels off, presumably to the river to drink. When he came back, he tied up the camels a little way away, and the other man joined him, leaving the girls by the fire. The 2 men began what looked like an increasingly tense discussion. Jane was sure that she and Maylee were the topic as they kept glancing at them as they talked. She began to feel a bit uneasy, to think they should be leaving. She discreetly drained their cup contents into the sand and buried the bits of bread when neither of their hosts were looking, and said quietly to Maylee, "I think we should go. There's something creepy about them." "Yes," Maylee agreed. "They're not very interesting. Let's go and explore." The girls got up, put their cups neatly by the pile of luggage, and with a polite smile of thanks and a small wave to the men, Jane took Maylee's hand and they walked away, trying to look casual, and carefully not looking behind them in case the men insisted they come back. They walked swiftly towards the river, which they could see shining and gleaming welcomingly through the trunks of the palms. When they got to the banks, they could see much further than previously, when the view had been blocked by clumps of palms. Beyond the banks of the far side of the river were undulating hills, scattered with trees, grasses, and shrubs. "That's odd," Maylee said. "I thought the Sahara was just sand." Dan the camel was thick of sand. "It's very odd," Jane said. "You definitely said you wanted to go to the Sahara, right?" "Yes, because Dan lived there." "Well, this doesn't look like a desert at all. Look over there, far away. Lots of trees. Odd." As Jane spoke, she was watching a log which was moving in a rather strange way in the river. It was moving sideways towards them, quite fast, which was strange, as the river was slow and moving in another direction. The log drifted to the shallows a little to the left of them and began to lift itself out of the water. It had legs, and as it moved swiftly up the riverbank, she saw it had a long, scaly tail. It stared at the girls with small, ancient eyes as it approached them. "Crocodile!" she yelped, pointing, and she and Maylee turned and ran, straight into the hands of the 2 men who had come up quietly and were standing behind them. Please join us next time for Chapter 7, The Puzzling Case of the Camels. And to show your support for this podcast, please subscribe and share it with your friends.